The lecture is mainly about where people's pedagogy comes from, so that they've got a sense of where their pedagogy comes from, so they can think about that and be able to articulate it and have some control about it as well.
Okay, so what I'll say is good morning, colleagues, because we're all teachers now. And what I want us to do today is to think about our pedagogy, because you've been developing your pedagogy over the last year and you will continue to develop it. And if you stay in teaching as long as I have, which is a long time, you will carry on developing your pedagogy because it never ends, really. And what I mean by pedagogy is the feelings, the beliefs, the ideals, the knowledge, principles that you have that will inform the way you work with your children to bring about learning for them. So it's about pedagogy, as I see it, is about believing something, thinking about something, and then doing it. Because of course the doing is what we do as teachers. And that's what people see, don't they? They see the doing. What they don't see is the believing and the thinking, which is underneath that. And what I want to do today is to explore where your pedagogy comes from, partly through thinking about where mine's come from over the last 30 years. And there will be sort of evidence of that because you will see what I do. And what happens when you see what people do is you interpret it in a particular way, don't you? But what I want to do today is model, and I want to model things when I'm teaching. What I want to try and model is how my believing and thinking about education and about children informs what I do, because that will be exactly the same for you. So on this chart, what you've got on your handout, I've put the questions that I want to talk about today. The first question I want to think about is, who are you as a teacher? And that's very wrapped up with who we are as a person, isn't it? And I think you'll find that because when you're in the classroom, you're quite vulnerable sometimes because people criticise something and you feel it personally, don't you? Because who you are as a teacher and who you are as a person, of course, inform each other. I want to think about what our values and beliefs, what our theories are that we've all got that underpin what we do. Then I want to think about, well, okay, we've got these ideas and what happens when we do it in the classroom, okay? And then, when we've done it, how do we evaluate whether it was a good thing to have done in the first place? And then thinking again about developing our pedagogy. So that goes around in a circle because that will change who you are. So what I want to start to explore is our pedagogy, how we teach. And I want to go through some objects here. I thought we'd start with this visual aid. It's a bit of a weighty term really here. Okay, does anybody recognise this? Yes? National curriculum, fine. So we all know a lot about the national curriculum, and in there is masses of subject knowledge. And in there and in associated documents, there's lots of ideas about how to teach, subject pedagogy. And you've also got lots of, like a toolkit for teaching, haven't you? Lots of strategies and things. But that is not your pedagogy. That will be part of your pedagogy. It will form your pedagogy. And I'll give you an example of why you know that's the case. Let's, for example, think we've got a lesson, and we'll have a lesson on adjectives. Now let's imagine everybody in this group had the same lesson plan, the same age group, same targets, what you want to achieve, the children are going to develop and use more interesting adjectives, okay? So you're all going to do the same lesson. Right, there we go. Lesson plan, solved, no problem. Is it going to be the same lesson? Well, surely it must be the same lesson. You've got the same lesson plan, same curriculum objectives. You could even have some teaching techniques. First of all, you will point to the national curriculum. Then you will write it on the board. It's not the same lesson. Okay, right. Let's think why it's not the same lesson. What differences would there be if somebody here took the lesson, somebody there took the lesson? Okay. Does anyone want to give me some suggestions as to why the lesson might be different?
We may be the same, the curriculum may be the same, but all the children we're teaching are different.
Right,
Their
lovely.
experiences are different.
Thank you. So one of the variables is going to be the child. And a session is co-constructed, isn't it? So, for example, if I had a different answer to that question, I'd have had a different response. So it's going to be different because of the children. Okay, are there any other differences that there might be in the session? apart from the children being different. And they're all sitting, let's imagine a day like today. It's been absolutely teeming with rain, and the children haven't been out to play for a week, and it's a Friday afternoon, and you're going to do a lovely lesson on adjectives. Is that going to be the same lesson as if it was a Monday morning? No. So the context is always going to be different, isn't it? The context between different schools. You've been in different schools. I can imagine you'd think, the lesson would be different in a different school. So the children are going to be different. The context is going to be different. And most important of all, the teachers are going to be different. So you're going to have different ideas. I just want to think about this lesson a bit more, this wonderful, exciting lesson you've got on adjectives. When you think about teaching a lesson, you don't just think of one objective, do you? You don't just think, I'm going to teach adjectives. You think of other things. So, for example, in the School of Education, it's all right, we'll just drop one clanger, shall we? We talk about SID. Okay, this is SID. Okay, and SID stands for social, intellectual, dispositional. And that's a shorthand for us to remember that when we're teaching a session, as well as teaching subject knowledge, we want to think about social learning. So we want to think about how we would include social learning in our context. So, for example, we might want children to work together. We might want to work in pairs and so on, social learning. We also think about intellectual learning. We want children to be able to problem solve, to be able to think for themselves, to be able to take risks in learning. So we're thinking about an objective for that. And dispositional is how they feel about themselves as learners, how they're confident, how they are resilient, how they're motivated, how they're keen. So let's just think about this lesson on adjectives. And we've got SID. What sort of social things might we do? Let's say we would like children to work together. Okay, so that's our pedagogical idea. How would we do that? Have a discussion in a pair, see if you can get some ideas.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, we obviously thought of some. So would any pair like to say any social activities that they thought they could do with these children to show that they're learning from each other? Because it's not just learning from the teacher, is it? So has anybody got a nice activity they might like to suggest? Done it in a pair. The idea was to give it in a pair was to give people confidence. So in a way, what we could argue is that was a sort of model in a way, because you'd say, okay, we'll have talking partners. So that's probably one of the things you thought about. People are nodding, yeah. So you could have talking partners, and you could see how many adjectives you could get in 1 minute. Or you could have one pair could have one set of adjectives, and the other pair could have another person could have the opposite. So they have to match big and small, tall and short, things like that. So you would be planning that sort of thing, wouldn't you? And that would be part of your thinking. You wouldn't just be thinking about your curriculum objective. You'd be thinking about other things about the children. If you were going to do intellectual, you might do a problem solving. Here's a nonsense text. Can you find the adjectives? Or dispositional. So all I'm trying to say is that you will be having other objectives in your teaching. Some of those will be planned and you've thought about because they're part of the school's policy. Most of them, I suspect, will come from what you believe is important. So if you believe cooperation in the classroom is important, you'll have those sort of objectives. But I just want to talk about one other example of pedagogy that's not really planned for. So you could say that you're planning for that pedagogy, you're thinking about it. But mostly in classrooms, what happens is you get dozens and dozens of children during the day coming up to you with things like, he's taken my pencil. I don't want to sit there anymore. I finished this. I can't do that. Yeah? Can I go out to play? You know, all the time. And you don't go and say, right, I'm just going to look that up and see what I'm going to say. Where is that in my lesson plan? because you have to do that instantly. And those are pedagogical moments. So we're just going to have a pedagogical moment here, and I have a pupil here who happens to be very good at art here, and she's going to come on her piece of work, and she's bringing her work up to me, okay? Busy art lesson, everybody's getting on. And I say to her, fine, put your name on the back and put it on the rack to dry. Thank you. Was that pedagogical interaction? No. That wasn't thinking about the needs of the child and the needs of the subject knowledge that she might be learning, or herself as a learner, or anything else. Now, this thinking that I've had about what Max van Manen, you can get him on the website, and he's a very interesting writer. He talks about pedagogical thoughtfulness, how all the time you're in this relationship with the child that requires you to do something or say something that's going to have an effect on their learning. And that could be learning about themselves, learning about subjects or whatever. And what we want to do is to get in this pedagogical moment and have a think about what we might do. So, if we could have Sally back with her picture again. Going to stand with her picture, right, end of lesson. Right, now, what sort of things could we think about in our believing and our thinking before we do the doing? What is important to you and what you might be thinking about, and then what I might do. So I'm going to do it, so this is role play, so you just have to tell me what I have to say to her. Okay, you won't see the thinking and the believing, but you'll see the doing. So have a little think. What sort of thing could I need to interact with her about? Okay. So should we have a suggestion from here?
We said basically to talk about the good points and get her to talk about it so that you can understand the kind of language that she's used. You can see whether she's, say, met the learning objective, whether she's done what you wanted to do, and also if she's not very confident in other subjects, you can kind of work on her enthusiasm in the subject she's good at, and hopefully that will go over to her other subjects.
Yes, that's lovely, because that's giving different objectives, isn't it? It's thinking about her self as a person and as a learner, as well as about her subject knowledge. And your point is that you could say to her, you know, tell me something about that, and see what she talks about, the colours and what she's noticed, because sometimes what you notice about it, of course, is not what the child really wants to talk about and is really interested in. So it's finding out that from her, actually, paying attention to it and be interested in it. I mean, one of the important things is, of course, there's no right answer to this. And it depends upon the child and how you perceive the child at that moment. And it depends on you and what you think is important, doesn't it? And that's where your underpinning values and principles come from. Yeah.
It really does depend on time in the lesson, but what's quite nice is if the other children can maybe celebrate their work as well, particularly with something like art. So maybe something like a gallery style format where the children can walk around, look at the work, and themselves ask questions of the artist. Because obviously our questions will be focused primarily on the learning and what the child's learned, but you find that the children will ask questions you can't even think of.
Yes, I think that's really good, and that's thinking about the child and also the other children and the other children's learning as well. That's lovely. Thank you. So you have you've had a pedagogical intent, you've done the pedagogical action. Now the outcome of that, of course, we don't know, and that's one of the things we have to think about, because you might intend something, but she might feel, so for example, I talked about the subject knowledge, and she might think, oh, she never said she liked it. So it's thinking about, well, how does the child experience that? And when we talk about evaluating our pedagogy, we'll have to think about that, I think.
In the next section, I want to start talking about my own experience as a child, because I think that's very important. And I'd like the participants to think about their own experiences of being a child in school and how those may have affected the way they think about learning and teaching, because I think those are very formative experiences. And then I'd like to move on to think about how their experiences of being a teacher will have affected the next stage where they're teaching. So the different experiences they will have had. And in that, I'd like to draw on my own experience, partly because I think having been a teacher for over 30 years, it's nice to sort of share things.
So what I'd like to do is look at this poster now, which is on the other side of your handout. In this, I want to talk about where your pedagogy might have come from. And I've put it within it's like a house really, which has got culture on the top. Because all our experience and our learning from experience sits within a cultural context. So all your learning will have been in the culture in which you live, in which you've grown up, in which you've been to school. Your schools are in a culture at this moment. So, for example, your schools will be very into testing at the moment. They'll be into privileging some subjects above other subjects. And I think it's really important when you hear stories of schools and stories of children, stories told by teachers, they're all bounded by the ideas that sometimes we don't really see, political ideas, ideological ideas that we don't even see. And our experience is in there. And what I've done is 3 circles. In the centre is our own personal school days when we were children. Secondly, all the teaching contexts that you might have. Now yours is blank because of course you have had teaching contexts which you could write in your schools that you've been in. But I've had quite a lot. For example, I've taught in primary schools, secondary schools. I'm teacher of the deaf, so I've taught in special educational contexts. And I suppose what I found from that is that pedagogical thinking is all the same. It doesn't matter whether the children are very young or whether they're adults. It's the same, the things that you have to think about, which actually is quite reassuring, isn't it? Because if you think about it now, then you can gradually build on that. The first bit I like to look at is our school days, our own personal school days. Now, the reason we have to think about that is a lot of people have written about what they call pedagogy, that you learn your pedagogy from when you were very small. You've had an apprenticeship in being a teacher from when you were very small. People talk about an apprenticeship of observation. You've sat in school and watched teachers. And they say it's an accidental apprenticeship. You didn't mean to be an apprentice teacher when you were 6, but perhaps you were. I'm not entirely convinced by that argument because I think what you don't see is the teacher's thinking, do you? You get the reaction to what happened in the classroom. You feel it. And I think if you look back to your school days, I'm sure you can remember things. And what happens is these events are very emotional. They might be very sad, very happy, very frightening, and you remember them. And these are going to affect the way you teach. And I want to give you an example. So the examples that I'm going to use over here are all examples from my own experience. I want you to think about your own as well. This is when I was 6 years old. One picture. This is an incident that happened to me. I went up to the teacher's desk with some writing, and there was the pedagogical moment. And one of the things I'd written the word cloths in my writing. I had some new cloths for my birthday, and it should have been clothes. Okay? Simple mistake. I can remember this teacher stopping the class, I was standing at the desk, saying to the class, now, we've got somebody here hasn't been listening when we've been doing our spelling rules. Can somebody in the class tell her what the rule is when you've got a sound which says O and we want to make it into O? Okay. So 1 or 2 people laughed, 1 or 2 people said what the answer should be. Now, that was I don't know what her pedagogical intent was. It could have been to get other people to help me to learn. But for me, as a learner, I can still remember how humiliated I felt and how I felt I was too scared to trust teachers, that they were going to show me up in front of the other people, that I was going to be making sure that I never put my hand up, that I retreated. And I was one of those very quiet little girls who nobody notices in the corner. So you think, okay, how does that then affect you when you come to teach in your teaching contexts? Now, I think that's quite interesting because for me, I had an observation from a colleague when I was teaching about 5 years ago. And he said to me, you had a table of students who weren't really engaged with what you were doing. Okay. Why didn't you point to individuals and say, okay, now you give me an example. Now you give me an example, to get them engaged. Now, from my own experience of that, I could never do that. I just could not do that to somebody else because I knew what it felt like. But then I thought, but is that meaning that I'm not actually challenging some people? Is my own personal experience inhibiting the way in which I now work with other students, which is disadvantaging them? Now I thought, well, I can't go around pointing at people because I can't do that. But I could have a situation where perhaps I say, okay, I'd like an answer from that table. In 5 minutes, have a chat and have an answer from the table or an answer from a group. So do you see what I mean? And I think for you, there may well be incidents in your school days that will really affect the way you think about teaching.
So what I want to do is look at the learner and how my concept of the learner has developed over time, the concept of learning and what it means to learn and support learning and how that's changed. And then the third thing about the learning environment, how the learning environment influences learning and what I feel about that.
How I view the learner has changed a lot. This is my little learner. And I think when I first started teaching, I view the learner very much as somebody who was going to learn stuff that I told them, that they didn't know a lot and I knew it. And my job as a teacher was to make sure they knew as much as they could before they went on to the next class. I think part of it changed by the opportunity to work with families with very young children. When you see very young learners, maybe 2-year-olds, young children are very robust learners, aren't they? You can't stop them learning. And we've all seen that. And I think one of the problems is when they come into school that they can lose that. And I think it's respect for the learner is something that I've learned over the 30 years. And that the children have so much in there and so many skills to enable them to learn. And part of our job is not to limit their learning, really, and to really build on what they know and can do. The other thing I think is actually learners are also very, very fragile in that we can quite easily, by the things we say or things we do, make them feel that they are not able to learn, make them lack confidence. And that can be true for children and adults. What I thought we might just do for just a minute is just to say to your friend anything that you thought from your last experience in school or the one before that would tell you that what you've thought about the learner, what your view of a learner is, what your underpinning thinking about the learner and their skills, how you can encourage them or how easy it is to deflate them, any examples you might have. Just have a little discussion with a friend of yours.
There was a couple of little girls, 2 twins, in my last placement, and they were so keen to tell you their life story they had their hand up for every single question.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult
Just finding the time.
Exactly. You want to hear their stories, and it's telling them kindly that you don't have time.
No.
You are interested in what they have to say, but doing that in such a way that they feel that their contribution is worthwhile.
Okay, has anybody got an example that they might like to talk about?
This was something that happened in a lesson I was actually observing, where there was a class that was divided on age rather than on current attainments, and the teacher was able to read the writing of all the children except one, and she was very kind and praised him very well, but he realised that she couldn't actually read his writing. It was a whole page just of symbols. And you could see him suddenly thinking, he was only 4, why can't she read what I've written when she can read what everyone else has done? And you could see his confidence just plummet, really.
Yes, that's a really interesting example, and it was reminding me, and probably it chimes with other people, of a little boy I was working with who hadn't been chosen to do something in assembly. And I said, oh, never mind, everybody has a turn, and you'll have a turn another time. And he said to me, oh no, Mrs. So-and-so only chooses good readers for assembly, and I'm a bad reader. And he was 7, I think. And he'd already got this view of himself. And it's trying to keep that powerful learner against, and balance that with the fragility to try and make sure that we've got that powerful learner there in time. And that's, in a way, leads me on to thinking about learning, what I've learned about learning. And this is the zone of proximal development. Now, we've all read Vygotsky, yes, we all know about the zone of proximal development, and I bet you never knew it could be made with cardboard boxes and sticky back plastic. What I'm thinking about in terms of zone of proximal development is this is the level where the child is at. And I really like the way you said current attainment, because there's a whole idea that it's about the child's ability. And of course, the child's ability can be immense, but their attainment, for a whole range of reasons, might not be very high in a particular topic at the moment. So this is where the child is now, and is quite confident there. This is where the child will be in the future, maybe in the next term. This, the zone of proximal development, is where the child could move up if they've got the support of somebody to teach them, like an adult or a peer to teach them. And this is the area that we work, the zone of proximal development. We have to be really good at being able to assessment for learning. Where is the child? Where does the child need to be? How can I move the child on to the next step? And all your subject knowledge will come into that, and all your knowledge of learning, knowledge of assessing children. And I suppose one of the things I've thought about is that in the zone of proximal development, we talk about scaffolding. You scaffold the learner, you support the learner. And I think what sometimes we forget when we're planning, and we plan small steps, and small steps are important, that some children need to run up the steps. Some children might take a spiral staircase. Some children might take the lift. There are other ways of moving. And if we're not careful, we limit the child. But if you offer things in a different way, then they could go up in the lift. Because you will have a lot of advice from various bodies saying, teach this. If you teach it this way, then the child will learn. If you do this every day, then the child will learn. Well, actually, that's not the case. There are times when that is inappropriate advice for a particular learner. And you will know that, because at the very beginning, the point was made, it's the children that are different. So that was my thinking about the learner and learning. And the last thing I want to think about is about the learning environment. How important is the learning environment? And why have I struggled to bring these? Did people notice these flowers? Yeah. One of the things I wanted to think about is how you make people feel welcome, and how you'll make people feel welcome in your classroom. Now, one way of doing it is providing something that's really nice to look at. And for me, something like flowers is really good. But for your classroom, it could be something completely different. I think when you make an effort to make the environment good, what you're showing is not just that the environment is nice, and somebody said about putting things on the wall and it looks really good, but also that you've thought enough about the other person. You're actually showing you care about the other person. Now, this was brought home to me very much when I was teaching in a prison, which is the most, I suppose, awful in terms of learning environment context that I've ever taught in. Most incredibly bleak context. And we used to take in flowers. The purpose of it was to make the environment a nicer, welcoming place to learn. I can remember one young man, and he actually pulled the head off one of the flowers, like that, and he held it in his hand. And I thought, is he going to say anything about it? And carried on. And later on in the session, he came up to me and he said, can you ask the officer if I can take this back to my cell? Because I want to take it back with me to remind me about nice things on the outside. And it really made me think that it is worth it. It is worth trying to make the learning environment as good as possible, partly because it shows you care about the other person. And certainly even the boys that thought it was girly to have flowers did appreciate the fact that I thought it would be nice for them, even if they actually didn't think it was nice for them. Do you see what I mean? It's the thinking about the learning environment and how you can create that learning environment. And then part of that becomes not just what it looks like visually, but that we care about each other and that we think about each other and that we respect each other in the classroom. And I think when you think about your new class, it's really important to think about what environment you're creating. And some of the rooms you'll have will not be ideal, but you can make them something special by who you are and what you do. And that's going to be about your values, beliefs, theories, and principles underpinning our pedagogy. Now, what I'd just like us to do to take for a minute to go back to that values, beliefs, theories, and principles, and write down 1 or 2 words that you think are really important to you, that are principles, that underpin how you think about the learner, learning environment, that you're going to take away and that are non-negotiable as far as you're concerned. You know, a trusting environment, close relationship with children, whatever is important for you that you're going to take into your school.
And in the final section, I want to think about how people will evaluate their pedagogy, how they will try to put themselves in the child's shoes, how they will learn from their own stories of teaching and other people's stories of teaching, and can then go on to learn from that evaluation, change the things they do, and therefore develop their pedagogy.
We've started to think, and obviously this is an ongoing thing that you'll be thinking about your beliefs, thinking about how you think. That's going to then result in you doing something in the classroom, isn't it? So that's going to be the way you act, and that's what will be seen. We then have to think, okay, well, actually, is that working? Is what I believe and think being reflected in what I do? And are children experiencing it like that? And how am I going to know? Well, some of it, of course, is by observation, isn't it? You can see. So when Sally came up with the picture, if I had said something inappropriate, you might have seen that from her facial expression. And I think one of the things about teachers is that they get very good at empathy, very sensitive to body language and facial expression. And I'm sure you are too. So you'll go in, for example, with a lesson, and you think, oh, I've got this lesson plan, I'm going to do this now. And you will know from the feel of the class that that was a bad plan, and you're going to have to change it. And people are nodding, aren't they? That's because you've got these antennae, you've got this sensitivity to other people already, and that's going to build and build and build as you go through your career. So one of the things is being empathetic, being able to understand people's perspectives. And I always represent that by putting yourself in the child's shoes. What is it like to be a child in my class? Maybe to sit in their seat, particularly the child who's being perhaps not paying attention as much as you would like. How are they sitting? I've done that occasionally with children and realised that they don't feel included because they're at the back. It's always much harder to engage people at the back, I find, than nearer the front. So it's thinking about things like that, putting yourself in the child's shoes, observing the child, asking the child. Even young children, you can ask them, what helps you to learn? What did you like about that lesson? What didn't you like? If it's like an inquiry. Older children can even write things down. You know, I like it best when my teacher does X or whatever. So ask them, because children are very perceptive. They've been in school for a long time. Another thing is to pay attention to your own stories. And I'm going to read you a very short story, one paragraph, of an event that happened to me about 5 years ago with a PGCE group. It was the last day of term. 150 trainee teachers were attending for the final lecture before the start of the holiday. The lecturer, that was me, had carefully prepared a PowerPoint presentation using both text and pictures. The lecturer started the session. Many of the students started writing. They were writing Christmas cards that were passed around and then opened by others. Smiles of acknowledgement were given. The lecturer felt separated from the students. She stopped and walked in front of the desk. I want to tell you a story, she said, about something that happened to me last week in school. The students stopped what they were doing. They looked at the lecturer. The silence in the room was intense. At the end of the story, the lecturer went back to her PowerPoint and the students went back to their Christmas cards. So what do you think I learned from that? Pages of writing, of reflection on that. Don't give up the day job. What do you notice about my teaching of this session today that's been informed by that?
There's lots of personal experience, and I found that in school as well. When you talk about yourself, the children absolutely love it, and
Yes.
they're so much more engaged than if you're kind of just telling them facts and information in a
Right.
sort of
Yes, so giving
different
personal
way.
experiences, personal examples, personal anecdotes, really helpful. Telling stories is really helpful, yes. So I think one of the things that's important is pay attention to your own stories. When you go back at night saying, oh, this day I've had, and you tell a story about it, or this wonderful, brilliant lesson that I did, and you tell a story about it, pay attention to that, because that will tell you a lot about your pedagogy and how it's working, how it's not working, and how you can develop it. So what I've been thinking about so far is your values and principles that are underpinning your pedagogy, how that might then affect what you do, and then how you might evaluate it. Okay? And the last thing is to think about, okay, I've got my pedagogy to this level, how am I going to develop it? And part of it, I think, is by paying attention to your teaching and other people's teaching. So somebody earlier gave an example of a lesson they observed. What do you notice? What do you feel emotionally? If you feel emotionally, that's great, or that wasn't so good, that's going to link to your underlying philosophy, your underlying pedagogy, what you think about learning and teaching. So try and think about that. You may decide to get engaged in some inquiry and some research in your classroom. So an example here of a book called Learning Without Limits, which is a story of a number of teachers, a lot of people have seen this book, a number of teachers who didn't want to limit their children's learning through ability labelling. So they decided that they were going to teach in a way that didn't include putting children in groups by so-called ability. And they would tell their stories. Their stories are written down in here in a book. And I think that's interesting in two ways. One, because you can read about other people's practice. Because the practice in your school doesn't have to be the practice that you'll do forever. I've taught in so many different situations. You'll teach in lots of different situations. But also that your story of your pedagogy is worth writing down, worth engaging with. I suppose just to finish off, I think we are all part of a result of our own experience, aren't we? Our own experience in school days, our own experience. And you can see from the way I've taught things that my heritage as a teacher of deaf children is quite clear, isn't it? You know, having the visual objects, making sure there's always a visual referent. And that we could go back to each of those and you could probably remember what was said about them. And I think that's quite powerful, thinking about visual memory. But more importantly, what I'd like to think about, just to finish off, is our own underlying pedagogical beliefs and how that's going to work for you in your classroom. So what I'd really like us to think about is, as we go off into our new classes, is to think about our underlying principles and beliefs, but what that's going to mean for the children in our classroom. So what's the experience of the child in your classroom going to be? So what I'd like you to do is get into role, be this imaginary child in your class. You can picture them if you like, thinking about what age group they are. And I'd like you to write a card that starts, Dear Mrs., Dear Miss, Dear Mr. This term in our class has been. And I'd like you to write what you'd really like those children to say. And that's going to reveal your underlying principles and philosophy. This term in our class has been. What I'd like you to do is think about that, and I'd like you to take it away with you, and I'd like you to put it somewhere. And then I'd like you to look at it, if you can remember, when you break up at the end of your first term, and have a look at it and say, is that how it is? And if it's not, don't panic. But it's nice to be reconnected with the vision, because we can get bogged down in all sorts of, bits and pieces, but always come back to the vision. What is your pedagogy, and what do you really want it to be? What do you believe, think, and do? Okay? And good luck. And thank you for your cooperation. You've been very good.
I think I'd really like students to take away from this session the understanding that their underpinning beliefs and values as a person and as a teacher are really important, and that they take those into the classroom and enact them in their pedagogy, and that to hold on to things that are really important to them and live them in the classroom.